Welcome to Wars and Dusk. Tonight, we journey to the Pacific, where 4 minutes of dive bombing rewrote the war, and where thousands of young men on both sides never came home. If history's greatest conflicts are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the past carry you to sleep. Settle in now. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. You are safe, and still, and there is nowhere you need to be. Tonight we travel back across the decades, to a stretch of open Pacific Ocean, to a morning in early June, to a handful of men making decisions in the half-dark that would echo through the rest of the 20th century. There is no need to hold anything tightly. Simply listen, and breathe, and let the story carry you gently toward rest. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the ocean in the hours before dawn. The Pacific is the largest body of water on Earth, wider than all the land masses of the world combined, and in June of 1942, it was also the most contested. Somewhere out there, beneath stars that cared nothing for human ambition, two great navies were moving toward each other. Neither could see the other yet. Neither knew exactly where the other was. But both knew that what was about to happen would determine the shape of the war for years to come. To understand the Battle of Midway, we must first understand the world that produced it. And that world, in the spring of 1942, was one that had been reshaped almost beyond recognition in the span of just a few months. 6 months earlier, on the morning of December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the strike had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 American servicemen. It was, by any measure, a spectacular tactical success. Japan had demonstrated to the world, and to itself, that it possessed a naval air power of extraordinary capability and reach. But the attack had not been a complete success, and the Japanese planners knew it. The 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, had not been at Pearl Harbor that morning. They were at sea, engaged in various operations, and they had survived untouched. To Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of Imperial Japan, this was a nagging concern. A significant one. Because Yamamoto, almost alone among Japan's senior military leaders, understood something that his colleagues did not always wish to hear, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. Yamamoto had studied in America. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had driven through the oil fields of Texas and visited the steel mills of the American industrial heartland, and he had come away with a sobering understanding of American productive capacity. Japan was an island nation, resource-poor, dependent on imported oil and raw materials. America was a continental giant, capable of building fleets and armies on a scale that Japan could not hope to match over time. The only path to Japanese victory, as Yamamoto saw it, was to destroy the American Pacific Fleet so thoroughly and so quickly that the United States would be compelled to negotiate a settlement before its industrial machine could shift into full production. Pearl Harbor had been the first blow in that strategy. But with the American carriers still afloat, the blow was incomplete. The carriers were the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. Yamamoto understood this better than almost anyone, and so the carriers had to be found and destroyed. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan's expansion across the Pacific and Southeast Asia had been breathtaking in its speed and scope. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Manila fell in early January. Singapore, the great bastion of British power in Asia, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops laying down their arms in what Winston Churchill would later call the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies fell. Burma fell. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines fell. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India in the west to the central Pacific in the east, and southward to the shores of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The speed and completeness of these conquests created a paradox. Japan had achieved its initial war aims, securing access to the oil and raw materials of Southeast Asia, far more quickly than expected. The question now was what to do next. And here, within the senior leadership of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a fundamental disagreement emerged. Some officers, particularly those associated with the Navy's general staff in Tokyo, favored consolidating what had been gained. Japan's new empire needed time to be organized, defended, and made economically productive. The priority, they argued, should be extending Japan's defensive perimeter and securing the resources already seized. They were cautious, bureaucratic, institutional men. Yamamoto saw things very differently. He was still haunted by those missing American carriers. As long as they survived, the United States retained the capability to strike back, and in April 1942, that capability was demonstrated in a way that shocked Japan and galvanized Yamamoto's sense of urgency. On April 18, 1942, 16 American B-25 medium bombers launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet, a carrier that her crew had never expected to be used in such a way, since B-25s had never before taken off from a carrier deck, and struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The bombs did limited physical damage, but the psychological damage was profound. Japan's home islands, which had been promised to be beyond the reach of enemy attack, had been struck. The emperor himself had been put at risk. Heads would roll. And Yamamoto, who had guaranteed the security of the home islands, felt the humiliation acutely. The Doolittle raid, named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, accomplished exactly what its planners had hoped for. It shook Japanese confidence. It boosted American morale at a moment of profound darkness. And it handed Yamamoto the argument he needed to win the internal debate within the Japanese Navy. The atoll itself consisted of two small coral islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, sitting inside a reef roughly 6 miles in diameter. Together they formed a landmass of about 2.5 square miles, most of it flat, sandy, and covered with short scrub vegetation. The population, in peacetime, had consisted of a small number of Pan American Airways staff who serviced the flying boats that crossed the Pacific. Now it held an American military garrison, airfields, fuel storage, ammunition dumps, and several thousand men who were about to find themselves at the center of history. In the strategic geography of the Pacific, Midway mattered for two reasons. First, it was the last American-held outpost of any significance west of Hawaii, and its capture would push the Japanese defensive perimeter to within striking distance of the Hawaiian Islands themselves. Second, and more importantly from Yamamoto's perspective, the Americans would never allow Midway to fall without a fight. Its loss would pose an unacceptable threat to Pearl Harbor. Therefore, an attack on Midway would draw out the American carriers, and once they came out, Yamamoto would be waiting. It was a reasonable plan, as far as it went. It had a clarity of logic that is easy to follow even at this distance. But it rested on a crucial assumption, the assumption that the Americans would be surprised. The assumption that they would not know Yamamoto was coming until he was already there. And that assumption, as we shall see, was about to be shattered. There is a building that still stands on the grounds of what is now called Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. In June of 1942, it was known simply as Station HYPO, or, more informally, as the Dungeon. It was a low, unremarkable structure, its windows blacked out against the Hawaiian sun, its interior filled with the sound of pencils scratching on paper, of men speaking quietly over codebooks and tables of numbers, of electric fans turning slowly in the tropical heat. Inside the dungeon, a small group of cryptanalysts, codebreakers, were doing something that would prove as consequential as any battle fought with guns and ships. They were reading the mail of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese naval cipher known as JN-25 was, by any reasonable assessment, a formidably secure communication system. It was a two-part code. The underlying codebook assigned numerical groups to words, phrases, and naval terms, and then a second layer of additive encipherment scrambled those numbers further. Breaking it required not only mathematical skill and linguistic knowledge but also enormous patience, and a willingness to sit for hours in a darkened room, holding fragments of intercepted messages up to the light of intelligence and intuition and hoping that something, some pattern, some repeated phrase, some navigational coordinate, would begin to emerge. The man in charge of Station HYPO was Commander Joseph Rockefort. He was, by most accounts, an unusual figure even by the standards of a profession that tended to attract unusual figures. He wore a smoking jacket and slippers in the dungeon, refusing to leave for days at a time when a particularly promising intercept was in progress. He was brilliant, stubborn, and possessed of a deep personal familiarity with Japan. He had lived there, studied the language, absorbed something of the culture. He was also, in the spring of 1942, in the middle of the most important work of his life. Rockefort and his team had been working on JN-25 for months. They could not read every message. Perhaps 30% of intercepted traffic could be decrypted with any confidence, and even that decryption was often partial, fragmentary, riddled with gaps that had to be filled by inference and educated guesswork. But what they were reading was enough to sketch the outlines of something large, something deliberate, something that was moving toward a point of convergence. Rockefort needed proof. And he found it through a piece of inspired deception. He suggested that Midway be instructed to send a message in the clear, unencrypted, in plain language, reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down and that the atoll was short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then began transmitting traffic about water shortages at AF, then AF was Midway. The gambit worked. Within days of Midway's deliberately planted plain language broadcast, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Rockefort had his proof. Midway it was. And now, if the Americans could assemble their forces in time, and deploy them correctly, they had the possibility of turning the tables on the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. The American commander in the Pacific was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had taken over as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, in the wake of Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was a Texan, the son of a hotel keeper, a quiet and deliberate man who inspired confidence in those around him without any apparent effort. He was not flashy. He did not make speeches. He listened carefully, weighed evidence patiently, and made decisions with a clarity of mind that became one of the defining characteristics of American Pacific strategy throughout the war. When Rockefeller's intelligence reached Nimitz, he made his decision with what might seem, in retrospect, like remarkable speed. He would concentrate every available carrier at Midway and set a trap. The Japanese believed they were the hunters. Nimitz intended to make them the prey. The forces available to Nimitz were limited. The Pacific Fleet in June 1942 was a very different thing from the great naval armada it would eventually become. Pearl Harbor had crippled the battleship force. Of the 3 Pacific carriers, one, the Saratoga, was undergoing repairs on the west coast. The Lexington had been lost at the Battle of the Coral Sea, just 1 month earlier. That left 2 operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, together forming Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. There was 1 more carrier, but her situation was dire. The Yorktown had also fought at the Coral Sea, and she had taken serious bomb damage. When she limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27, the initial assessment from the repair crews was that she would need 3 months in dry dock to be made fully operational again. Nimitz did not have 3 months. He had days. He went to the dry dock himself, looked at the damage, talked to the men, and told them he needed the Yorktown ready in 72 hours. They worked around the clock, 1,400 men, in shifts, welding and patching and repairing, and in 72 hours, the Yorktown sailed. She was not fully repaired. There were still workers aboard her who would not be taken off before she left the harbor. But she was seaworthy, and she could fly aircraft, and in the calculus of June 1942, that was enough. So Nimitz sent 3 carriers to the waters north of Midway. He sent them under a cloak of secrecy, ordering radio silence, routing them through areas thought to be beyond Japanese reconnaissance range. He briefed their commanders on what the intelligence suggested, that the Japanese strike force would approach from the northwest, that it would consist of 4 fleet carriers with powerful escorts, and that the attack on Midway would likely come on the morning of June 4. To the men on those carriers, the knowledge of what was coming must have felt both clarifying and terrifying. They were going to be outnumbered. They were going to face the same force that had shattered Pearl Harbor, the same airmen who had seemed invincible across 6 months of unbroken conquest. But they had something that those airmen did not: they knew where to look. And on a clear morning in the Central Pacific, with the stars still visible above the horizon and the sea running low and dark, the Americans took up their positions and waited. To understand the confidence, the deep, structural confidence, of the Japanese High Command in the spring of 1942, it helps to spend some time with the fleet that confidence was built upon. Because the force that Yamamoto was sending toward Midway was not merely large. It was, by the standards of June 1942, something close to overwhelming. The centerpiece of Japan's naval power was the Kido Butai, the strike force, or mobile force, a concentrated carrier battle group unlike anything that had existed before in the history of naval warfare. The concept of massing fleet carriers together into a single striking unit was Yamamoto's innovation, born of his conviction that naval air power had made the battleship obsolete, and that the future of naval warfare would be decided not by the 15-inch guns of dreadnoughts trading shells across the horizon, but by aircraft, launched from flat-topped ships, reaching hundreds of miles beyond the range of any surface gun. The Kido Butai that sailed toward Midway in late May 1942 was built around 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. These were not simply large ships. They were the finest instruments of naval aviation that Japan possessed, and their air groups represented the concentrated experience of years of training and, in many cases, months of actual combat. The Akagi, whose name meant Red Castle, was the flagship. She was Vice Admiral Chichi Nagumo's command ship, the vessel from which he would direct the operation. The Akagi had been built originally as a battlecruiser, then converted to a carrier under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, and she carried a distinctive flight deck profile, a shorter upper deck for landing, a longer lower deck for launching, that had been modified over the years but still retained something of the improvised quality of her conversion. She was fast, capable, and her air group was among the most experienced in the Japanese Navy. The Kaga was larger, originally laid down as a battleship before her conversion, slower than the Akagi but carrying a heavier complement of aircraft. The Soryu and the Hiryu were a matched pair of purpose-built fleet carriers, faster and more modern, designed from the keel up for carrier operations. Between the 4 of them, the Kido Butai could put somewhere in the range of 250 aircraft into the air. The man commanding this force was Vice Admiral Chichi Nagumo. He was 60 years old, a torpedo specialist by training rather than an aviator, elevated to command of the carrier force partly by seniority and partly by the internal politics of the Japanese Navy. He had led the Kido Butai at Pearl Harbor and in the raids that followed, against Darwin in Australia, against Colombo, and Trincomalee in Ceylon, and in all of these operations, the Kido Butai had performed with near-perfect efficiency. No carrier had been lost. No significant damage had been suffered. The aura of invincibility that surrounded the force was, from Nagumo's perspective, not entirely unreasonable. But there were those who worried about Nagumo's temperament. He was a cautious man, more cautious, perhaps, than the command of the world's most powerful carrier force required. He followed orders precisely, which was a virtue, but he was not always comfortable with the kind of rapid, improvised decision-making that carrier warfare would eventually demand. His staff, who were more experienced in aviation, sometimes found themselves trying to steer him gently toward bolder options. It was not always a comfortable dynamic. The men who flew from those carriers were, in many cases, the finest naval aviators in the world in June of 1942. The Japanese Naval Air Training Program had been extraordinarily rigorous and selective, only a small fraction of candidates completed it, and the pilots who emerged were extraordinarily skilled. Many of the aviators aboard the Kido Butai had been flying for 5 years or more. Many had combat experience in China, going back to the late 1930s. They had refined the art of dive bombing, torpedo attack, and coordinated strike to a very high level. This last point would become significant. Japan's training pipeline, while producing exceptional quality, produced smaller quantities. There were perhaps a few hundred truly first-rate naval pilots in all of Japan in 1942. They were a precious, finite resource. And unlike the United States, Japan did not yet have a system in place for rapidly expanding that resource, for cycling experienced pilots back from frontline service to training commands, where they could pass their skills to new generations before those skills were lost. This was a vulnerability that no one in Tokyo was inclined to discuss too openly. It was easier to focus on the victories, on the confidence, on the relentless forward momentum that had carried Japan from triumph to triumph across 6 months of war. The Kido Butai was the embodiment of that momentum, a magnificent instrument, capable of operations of astonishing precision, sailing now across the flat Pacific toward what its commanders expected to be another decisive victory. Around the carriers moved a powerful escort, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and further behind them came the invasion fleet, transports carrying troops intended for the capture and occupation of Midway itself, cruisers and destroyers providing escort, supply ships following in their wake. The whole operation involved more than 100 ships, the largest fleet assembled in the Pacific War to that point. Yamamoto himself commanded the overall force from his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, lying some 300 miles behind the carriers. That separation, 300 miles, was itself a source of tension. Yamamoto had placed himself too far back to exercise effective tactical control. The Kido Butai would have to fight on its own, with communications back to Yamato slow and unreliable. The distance reflected Yamamoto's understanding of the strategic situation but created a command and control problem that would have consequences. The Japanese operation order was precise and detailed. The Kido Butai would launch a strike to neutralize Midway's air defenses and airfields, clearing the way for the landing of troops. At some point, the Japanese expected before the strike on Midway, the American carriers would appear. They would be engaged and destroyed by the Kido Butai's air groups before they could do significant damage. The operation was expected to last perhaps 3 days, after which Midway would be in Japanese hands and the American Pacific Fleet would be broken. It was a plan that assumed the Americans would react to events rather than shape them. It was a plan that assumed surprise. And it was a plan that was already, even as the Kido Butai moved eastward across the Pacific, beginning to unravel, in a blacked-out building in Pearl Harbor, where Joseph Rockefeller's men were reading, and reading, and reading. There is a quality to waiting that is unlike any other experience in war. It is not the sharp animal clarity of immediate danger. It is something slower, and in some ways harder, a sustained, deliberate state of preparation for violence that you know is coming but cannot precisely time. The men of Midway's garrison lived inside that state through the last days of May and the first days of June 1942. Midway Atoll, in those days, was a place of considerable military busyness superimposed on a natural setting of strange, quiet beauty. The 2 coral islands, Sand and Eastern, were home to enormous colonies of Lyson albatrosses, the birds that sailors once called goony birds for their ungainly quality on the ground. They nested everywhere, indifferent to the military activity around them, to the sound of aircraft engines warming up, to the constant movement of trucks and equipment, to the tension that had settled over the place like a second sky. The garrison on Midway numbered some 3,000 men by early June. They included Marine Corps defenders, Naval Air Station personnel, Army Air Forces units, and a collection of Navy patrol aircraft crews. Commander Cyril Samar was the senior naval officer on the atoll, but the defense planning fell largely to Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, whose infantry and artillery units would be responsible for repelling any landing attempt. In the weeks leading up to June 4, Midway had been reinforced as rapidly as possible. Additional aircraft had been flown in, a mixed collection that reflected both the urgency of the situation and the limited resources available. There were Marine Corps Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats for fighter defense, though the Buffaloes in particular were already obsolete and hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters they would face. There were Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, which the Army believed could be used against enemy ships, though doctrine and equipment for this mission were both still immature. There were Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, elderly and underpowered, flown by Marine Corps pilots who knew perfectly well what they were flying and flew them anyway. There were Navy PBY Catalina flying boats for long-range patrol and reconnaissance, patient, slow aircraft that would prove invaluable in the hours before the battle. The men who flew these aircraft knew the odds. They had been briefed, or could read the situation clearly enough without a formal briefing. They were going to fly against the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor. They were going to meet Zero fighters and aircraft that could not outrun, outclimb, or outmaneuver them. The B-17 crews believed, with some reason but also some optimism, that their altitude and their Norden bomb sight would let them strike ships from above the range of anti-aircraft fire. The torpedo bomber crews and the dive bomber crews had no such comfort. And yet the preparations went forward with what an observer would later describe as a kind of purposeful calm. Ammunition was distributed. Aircraft were serviced. Fuel reserves were checked. Artillery positions were dug and reinforced. Anti-aircraft guns were calibrated and tested. The men went about their work with the thoroughness of people who have decided that thoroughness is the only thing they can control. The PBY Catalinas flew their long, slow patrols out to the northwest, each one covering a sector of ocean like a spoke on a wheel, flying out 700 miles before turning back, the crews scanning the surface of the water for the telltale shapes of ships. It was tedious, exhausting work. The Catalina was not a comfortable aircraft for long missions, cramped, noisy, with an altitude limitation that kept it below the clouds where the sun could beat down relentlessly. But it was patient work, and patience was what the situation required. On the morning of June 3, the day before the main battle, a PBY crew piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted something extraordinary. At the limit of his patrol range, nearly 700 miles southwest of Midway, Reed saw ships. Not a few ships. Many ships. He counted what he believed to be a main body of the Japanese fleet. In fact, he had found the invasion transport convoy and its escort, not the carriers. But his report reached Midway and Pearl Harbor and confirmed what the intelligence had been suggesting for weeks. The Japanese were coming. B-17s flew from Midway to attack Reed's contact that afternoon. They dropped their bombs from high altitude with conviction and considerable noise. They hit nothing. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships was, in practice, far less effective than the doctrine suggested. The bombs raised great columns of water. The Japanese ships turned and maneuvered and took no damage at all. But the crews returned to Midway reporting that they had attacked the Japanese fleet, and for a few hours, morale on the atoll was briefly elevated. The carriers, the real prize, the Keto Butai, were somewhere further to the northwest, beyond the range of that afternoon's patrol. They had not yet been found. But the clocks were ticking. Sunrise on June 4th was coming, and with it, everything that had been planned and feared and prepared for over the previous weeks. In the last hours of June 3rd, the garrison on Midway settled into what rest it could find. Some men slept. Some did not. Some wrote letters that they sealed and left in careful places where they might be found if things went wrong. The albatrosses nested and shifted and called their odd, braying calls in the darkness, indifferent to the weight of history gathering overhead. Somewhere to the northwest, on the flight deck of the Akagi, Japanese air crews were also resting, or trying to. Their launch was scheduled for before dawn. The strike force would be in the air and on its way to Midway before the first light touched the horizon. Nagumo expected to find an atoll softened, perhaps broken, its airfields cratered, its defenses suppressed. He expected to find it, and then, after it was done, to find the American carriers. He did not expect to find what was waiting for him. The morning of June 4, 1942, began in the darkness before dawn, with the sound of aircraft engines awakening one by one across the flight decks of 4 Japanese carriers. The Keto Butai had arrived at its launch position during the night, a point roughly 240 miles northwest of Midway, and now, under a sky still full of stars, the crews of the first strike began their preparations. Vice Admiral Nagumo had launched a search mission before the strike. 7 aircraft, mostly floatplanes from the escorting cruisers, were dispatched in a fan pattern to search the ocean to the east and southeast of the fleet. This was standard doctrine: search first, then strike. The problem was that the searches were not executed with the thoroughness the situation demanded. Some of the search aircraft were delayed in their launch. One search leg, the one that would have taken a floatplane from the cruiser tone directly over the area where the American carriers were waiting, was launched 30 minutes late due to a mechanical problem with the catapult. That 30-minute delay would have consequences that no one yet suspected. On Midway, the radar on Eastern Island picked up the incoming strike at approximately 0534, 93 miles out, a solid, unmistakable return on the screen, a large group of aircraft approaching from the northwest. The air raid alarm sounded. Every fighter on Midway that could fly was scrambled, 26 aircraft in all, a mix of Wildcats and Buffaloes. The slow patrol aircraft, the Catalinas, the B-17s, were ordered into the air to get them out of the way of the bombs. The ground crews took cover in the shelters they had prepared. The American fighters climbed to intercept. What followed was, by any honest assessment, a near massacre. The Zero escorts tore through the defending fighters with terrible efficiency. The Buffaloes, in particular, were helpless against Zeros that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. Of the 26 fighters that scrambled to defend Midway, 17 would be shot down or so heavily damaged as to be written off. The surviving pilots described the Zeros as appearing to play with them, making slow, contemptuous passes before dispatching them with bursts of cannon fire. And yet the garrison below did not simply absorb the attack passively. The anti-aircraft guns opened up with everything they had. The sky above Midway became dense with black puffs of shell bursts, and the Japanese bomber formations, forced to fly through this curtain of fire, took losses. 6 of Tomonaga's aircraft were shot down. More were damaged, some so seriously that they would not make it back to the carriers. The bombing itself was heavy and sustained. Japanese bombers worked methodically across the airfields, cratering runways, destroying fuel storage tanks, hitting gun positions and hangars. The Eastern Island airfield was badly damaged. Sand Island took significant hits. Fuel burned with thick black smoke that rose into the clear morning sky and could be seen from the decks of the carriers far to the northwest. The power station and some shore installations were destroyed. But when the smoke began to clear and the damage was assessed, one thing was clear: the airfields were not completely out of operation. The runways could be repaired. Aircraft were still flying from Midway. The garrison was hurt, but it had not been broken. Tomonaga surveyed the damage as his force turned for home, and he sent a message that would prove fateful. "There is need for a second attack," he radioed. The result of the first strike had been insufficient. Midway needed to be hit again before troops could land. Meanwhile, from Midway itself, waves of aircraft had been launching throughout the morning to attack the Japanese fleet. It was an extraordinary and largely tragic effort, brave men in inadequate aircraft attacking the most powerful carrier force in the world, sometimes without fighter escort, sometimes without effective weapons, always against odds that should have made the enterprise hopeless. The Marine Corps dive bombers and torpedo planes went in first, in small groups, pressing their attacks through a wall of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The results were catastrophic. Most were shot down without hitting anything. Those few who survived limped back to Midway with damaged aircraft and the knowledge that they had done what they could. The Army B-17s dropped their bombs from altitude with the usual result: many bombs, many columns of water, no hits. Their crews believed they had struck the carriers. The photographic evidence would later tell a different story. Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, newly arrived at Midway and flying their first combat mission, pressed their attack with devastating personal cost. Of the 6 Avengers that attacked, 5 were shot down. The one surviving aircraft returned with a dead gunner and a wounded radioman and a torpedo that had failed to release, its crew intact only by some combination of skill and extraordinary luck. All of this fierce, costly, largely unsuccessful attacking was nevertheless doing something important. It was forcing Nagumo and the Kido Butai to keep their combat air patrol up at full strength, which was consuming fuel and putting stress on the fighters. It was preventing the Japanese from relaxing their vigilance. And it was keeping Nagumo's attention fixed on the immediate threats he could see, rather than the threat he could not yet see, the one that was waiting for him over the horizon to the northeast. At 0728, the cruiser toned search plane, the one that had launched 30 minutes late, sent a message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo had been waiting for this. He had been expecting the Americans to appear. But the timing was extremely difficult, because at precisely this moment he was also managing Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway, and his carriers had already begun rearming their reserve aircraft with bombs for that second strike. Now those same aircraft might need to be rearmed again, this time with torpedoes, for use against ships. Nagumo asked for a clarification: what types of ships had been sighted? The answer, when it came, took 9 more precious minutes to arrive. The enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers. Then, another 8 minutes later, came a revision that must have sent a chill through the flagship. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. 1 carrier. Nagumo had expected carriers to appear, but perhaps not this quickly, not at this range, not while the first strike was still in the air and his deck crews were in the middle of a complex rearming operation that had spread bombs and torpedoes across every available surface below decks. In the next 20 minutes, Nagumo would make the most consequential decision of his career. And the wrong decision. But he did not yet know it was wrong. He was a careful man, doing careful math, weighing options that all seemed to carry risk. He decided to recover the first strike before launching against the American carriers. He decided to wait until he had a full, organized strike ready, a proper attack, not a piecemeal one. He ordered the rearming to continue, the aircraft to be respotted on the flight deck. Below decks, the confusion of the rearming operation deepened. Bombs were piled in hangar bays rather than struck back to the magazines. Torpedoes were laid aside. The carriers that had looked, from the outside, like the embodiment of naval efficiency were, at this particular moment, threading a needle of operational complexity that left them vulnerable in ways that their reputation had made it easy to overlook. The American carriers, still unseen to the northeast, were already launching their aircraft. In the hours before dawn on June 4, Task Forces 16 and 17 moved through the darkness north of Midway, their crews at battle stations, their commanders studying what intelligence they had and trying to time what was coming. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 aboard the Enterprise, had been given his orders and his intelligence briefing by Nimitz personally. He knew the approximate position from which the Japanese were expected to launch, he knew the approximate time of the strike, and he had spent the hours of darkness working through the geometry of the problem. Spruance was an unusual choice to command the carriers. He was a surface warfare officer, not an aviator. The carrier task force had been intended for Vice Admiral William Halsey, the aggressive, famous Bull Halsey, who was the most celebrated American naval commander in the Pacific. But Halsey had developed a severe skin condition, psoriasis so debilitating that he could barely function, and had been hospitalized just before the fleet sailed. In a remarkable act of professional generosity, Halsey had personally recommended Spruance as his replacement, telling Nimitz that of all the officers he knew, Spruance was the one best suited to handle the assignment. Spruance was quiet where Halsey was flamboyant. He was analytical where Halsey was instinctive. He ate simply, slept regularly, walked the flag deck every morning for exercise, and was known among his staff for a quality of almost unnerving calm in difficult situations. He also had beside him, as his aviation officer, Captain Miles Browning, who understood carrier air operations with an expert's knowledge and whose advice Spruance valued and used, though Browning's temperament was considerably more volatile than his admiral's. At 0600, Spruance received reports from Midway indicating that the Japanese carriers had been found. He knew, from the intelligence picture, approximately where they were. He now faced the central tactical question of the morning: when to launch. Spruance and Browning worked through the numbers. The conclusion they reached was bold: launch now, at extreme range, trusting that the Japanese would be caught with their flight decks crowded and their carriers vulnerable during the recovery and rearming operation. The moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability would be brief. But if the American strike could arrive at precisely that moment, the consequences could be decisive. This fragmentation would, ironically, prove to be both a curse and a curse for the individual squadrons who arrived alone, without support, against fully alert defenses, a gift for the overall battle, because the disorganized American attacks kept the Kido Butai's combat air patrol stretched and confused, chasing one threat after another, spending fuel and attention in ways that left the carriers exposed at the critical moment. The first American group to find the Japanese fleet was not the dive bombers but the torpedo bombers, and their experience, over the next hour and 20 minutes, would become one of the most painful chapters in American naval aviation history. Torpedo Bombing Squadron 8, known as VT-8, flew from the Hornet. They were equipped with the Douglas TBD Devastator, an aircraft that had been considered modern when it was designed in the mid-1930s but was now, in June 1942, dangerously obsolete. It was slow, barely faster than the airspeed at which it needed to fly to drop its torpedo effectively, and that airspeed was agonizingly within the performance envelope of the Zero fighter. The Devastator carried its torpedo slung beneath its belly, and to drop it effectively required flying straight and level at low altitude, at a constant speed, for a long approach run. It was, in the language of a later era, a demanding delivery profile in a permissive environment. The environment on June 4, 1942, was anything but permissive. VT-8 arrived over the Japanese fleet without fighter escort. The Wildcats assigned to cover them had become separated in the confusion of the launch and rendezvous. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, commanding VT-8, had found the Japanese fleet by a combination of navigation skill and what his pilots later described as something close to instinct. When the official search track came up empty, Waldron had turned southwest and found exactly what he was looking for. He led his 15 aircraft down toward the carriers without hesitation. VT-6 from the Enterprise and VT-3 from the Yorktown followed, each suffering terribly. Of 41 Devastators that attacked in these three waves, 35 were shot down. The torpedoes they managed to release were old, slow, unreliable. The Mark 13, a weapon that ran too deep, detonated too infrequently, and could not be dropped at speeds higher than a crawl. Not a single torpedo hit was scored on a Japanese ship. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was real, and it was enormous, and it should not be sentimentalized into something it was not. These were young men who flew into a situation that should have killed all of them, and nearly did, and the fact that their death served a larger purpose was something that could only be seen afterward, and only from a distance. In the moment, it was simply catastrophe after catastrophe, wave after wave of aircraft going down into the sea. But something was happening, even as the torpedo bombers died. The Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down, again and again, to low altitude, the altitude where the torpedo approach had to be made. Each time they dove to intercept, they spent fuel and spent time, and climbing back to altitude took minutes they would not have. The sky above the Japanese carriers, at medium and high altitude, was becoming, for a brief window, lighter in terms of fighter coverage than it had been at any point that morning. Above the clouds, invisible to the men on the Japanese carriers below, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were searching. Some had been searching for over an hour, their fuel gauges dropping toward the red. Some had given up and turned back. But some were still there, still looking, and one of them, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bomber groups, was about to make the navigation decision that would seal the fate of the Quito Butai. The moment we have been building toward, the 4 minutes that gave this battle its most enduring description, arrived at approximately 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942. It is worth approaching that moment slowly, because it deserves the weight of its context. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey had been searching, his fuel depleting below comfortable levels. His 2 dive bomber squadrons, VS-6 and VB-6 from the Enterprise, had followed the prescribed course to the expected position of the Japanese fleet and found nothing. The Quito Butai had turned during the recovery of the first strike, and the ocean where they were supposed to be was empty. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading VB-3 from the Yorktown, had found the fleet on his own, approaching from a slightly different angle. The Japanese carriers were below, visible from altitude, 4 great ships moving in the blue water, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of preparation for launch. The Akagi and the Kaga had nearly finished respotting their aircraft for the strike against the American carriers. The Soryu had been slower in its rearming and was still working. On all 4 flight decks, the activity was intense, refueling hoses connected, bombs and torpedoes being positioned, pilots climbing into cockpits for the launch that was minutes away. And there, beneath the dive bombers, almost no fighter protection at altitude. The Zeros were below, or engaged, or landing to refuel. The altitude above the carriers was, for a few minutes, nearly open. McCluskey divided his attack between the Akagi and the Kaga. Leslie's squadron went for the Soryu. The pilots nosed over into their dives, nearly vertical, at speeds that built toward 400 miles per hour, the wind screaming across the cockpit frames, the altimeter unwinding, the carriers growing in the windshield, and they dropped their bombs. What happened in the next 4 minutes is difficult to describe with the calm precision it deserves, because what happened was, in the objective language of military history, catastrophic for the Japanese Navy. The Kaga was hit by 4 bombs in rapid succession. They struck the flight deck in a pattern that ignited the aircraft gathered there, aircraft loaded with fuel and armed with bombs and torpedoes for the strike that was never launched. The fuel caught. The bombs began to cook off in the heat. The torpedoes detonated. The fire spread below decks with terrifying speed, ignited by the bombs and fuel hoses that had been left scattered during the rearming process rather than returned to the magazines. Kaga became, in minutes, a roaring inferno. The Akagi took 2 hits, some accounts say possibly 3, but the hits were perfectly placed. One bomb struck the flight deck amidships and penetrated to the upper hangar deck, where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. A second bomb struck near the stern, in an area where the rearming operation had left torpedoes and bombs on the hangar floor rather than in their magazines. The result was a cascade of secondary explosions that no damage control effort could have contained. Nagumo's flagship was on fire within minutes. The Soryu took 3 hits in rapid succession, her flight deck pierced and her hangar decks consumed by fire almost as quickly as the other 2. In those 4 minutes, from the moment the first bomb was released to the moment the last aircraft pulled out of its dive, 3 of the 4 carriers of the Quito Butai had been struck mortal blows. 3 ships that had been, just minutes before, the most powerful instruments of naval aviation in the world were now dying, burning, their aircraft and their pilots and their decades of institutional knowledge being consumed by fire in the Central Pacific. It is important to note what had made this possible. It was not merely the skill of the American dive bomber pilots, though that skill was real and significant. It was the convergence of factors that had been building since before the battle began: Rockefeller's codebreaking, which had told the Americans where to wait; Nimitz's courage in committing his carriers to the fight; McCluskey's decision to keep searching rather than turn back; the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, which had drawn the Zeros to low altitude; and the 30-minute delay in the Tone search plane, which had given Nagumo's critical intelligence just late enough to paralyze his decision-making at the worst possible moment. No single one of these factors, by itself, would have been enough. Together, they had produced a 4-minute window in which the greatest carrier force in the world was unprotected, and American dive bombers had arrived at precisely that window. On the burning Akagi, Nagumo was told that the ship could not be saved. He was reluctant to leave, reluctant in the way of captains and admirals who feel, perhaps, that their fate should be tied to the fate of their ships. His staff virtually had to drag him to a rope lowered from the bridge and onto a waiting vessel. He transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara and continued to command what was left of his force. But what was left of his force was, in the critical sense, already diminished beyond recovery. 3 carriers burning. 1 carrier, the Hiryu, still intact, her aircraft still armed and fueled, her air group still at fighting strength. The Hiryu would fight. She would strike back with ferocity. But she was one ship against what remained of 3 American carrier airgroups. The balance of the day was already tipping, irrevocably, in one direction. The Hiryu was the smallest of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, but she was among the fastest and most capable. Her captain was Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who was widely considered one of the most talented officers in the Japanese Navy, bold, clear-minded, decisive in ways that Nagumo sometimes was not. When the bombs fell on the other 3 carriers, Yamaguchi did not wait for orders. He launched his aircraft immediately, with whatever he had ready. The first Hiryu strike, 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts, found the Yorktown at approximately 1200. The Yorktown's combat air patrol was up and fighting. The anti-aircraft fire was heavy. Of the 18 Japanese dive bombers, only 8 reached a release position, and of those 8, 3 scored hits. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. 1 hit the flight deck and penetrated to the machinery spaces, causing fires that snuffed out the ship's boilers and left her dead in the water. A second and third hit compounded the damage. The Yorktown slowed, then stopped. Black smoke poured from her interior. She lay still in the water, and to any Japanese observer it would have been entirely reasonable to conclude that she was finished. But the Yorktown was not finished. Not yet. The damage control parties aboard her were extraordinary, the legacy of those 72 hours in Pearl Harbor, perhaps, when the men who had repaired her had built into her something of their own determination. Within an hour, her engineers had restored enough boiler power to give her 17 knots. Her flight deck was patched enough to resume limited operations. She was not the ship she had been, but she was alive, and she was fighting. Yamaguchi's second strike from the Hiryu, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 Zero escorts, found the Yorktown at 1445. The Japanese torpedo bomber crews, who were among the most experienced in the fleet, pressed their attack with skill and determination. Two of their torpedoes struck the Yorktown on the port side, deep blows that flooded her port machinery spaces and gave her a dangerous list. The list reached 26 degrees, the point at which capsizing became a real possibility, and Admiral Fletcher, who had already transferred his flag when the first attack came, gave the order to abandon ship. The Yorktown's crew went over the side in good order, clinging to life rafts and life jackets in the warm water of the Pacific. They watched their ship from the water. She was still afloat, still listing, but not yet gone. The loss of the Yorktown, or what appeared to be her loss, was the Hiryu's last significant contribution to the battle. Because even as the Hiryu's returning aircraft were landing, the American dive bombers from the Enterprise had found her. 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked the Hiryu at approximately 1700. The Japanese combat air patrol was up, but the Hiryu's fighter strength was badly depleted by a day of combat operations. 4 bombs struck her flight deck in the space of seconds, each one crashing through the wooden planking and detonating in the hangar below. The same cascade of secondary explosions that had destroyed her sister ships now consumed her. By evening she was burning from bow to stern, and Yamaguchi ordered his crew to abandon ship. Yamaguchi chose not to leave. He made his decision quietly, in the manner of a man who has thought carefully about what honor requires. He told his captain, Captain Tomio Kaku, who made the same choice, that he intended to remain with the ship. He wrote farewell letters. His crew, when they learned of his decision, were devastated. Many tried to stay with him, and had to be ordered over the side. Before dawn on June 5, the Hiryu sank. Yamaguchi was 52 years old. He had been considered a possible future commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. His death was a personal tragedy and, in a more clinical sense, a significant loss for Japanese naval command. Back on the water, the Yorktown was refusing to die. She had not capsized. She had not sunk. She floated, damaged and listing, through the afternoon and into the night. The following morning, a salvage party went back aboard and began working to save her. They made real progress. The list was being controlled. There was genuine hope that she might be towed back to Pearl Harbor. But in the early morning of June 6, 2 days after the main battle, a Japanese submarine found her. The I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been ordered to find and finish the damaged Yorktown. After a careful search, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck the Yorktown, and 2 struck the destroyer Hammond, which was lashed alongside providing power for the salvage operation. The Hammond sank almost immediately. The Yorktown absorbed the torpedoes, held on through the night, and finally sank at 0600 on June 7, more than 2 days after the initial attack, and after fighting for her life with a stubbornness that became part of her legend. In those final hours before she went under, it is said that some of the men on the salvage party, standing on her tilting deck, wept openly. Not the uncomplicated tears of grief, but something more complex, the recognition that a thing they had built and repaired and sailed and fought from had given everything it had, down to the last moment, and that it was now passing from the world. The sea closed over the Yorktown, and the salvage party was taken off, and the Pacific was quiet again. The sinking of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers did not end the Battle of Midway. It ended its decisive phase, the phase in which the fundamental outcome was determined. But the fighting and the dying continued for several days as the remaining forces of both fleets maneuvered through the Pacific. Yamamoto, 300 miles to the rear aboard the Yamato, received the reports of the carrier losses with a stoicism that those present described as almost inhuman in its stillness. He sat with the messages in front of him and said very little for a long time. Then he began to consider his options. They were not, at this point, without possibility. He still had enormous surface strength, battleships and cruisers that had not fired a shot. He still had some carrier capability, the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo with the Northern Diversion Force and the Aleutians, and the heavily damaged Zuho accompanying other fleet elements. He briefly considered a night surface action, sending his battleships racing toward Midway under cover of darkness, where their huge guns might do what his carriers had failed to do. This was a scenario that frightened some of the American commanders, who knew that their own strength in surface ships was limited. But Yamamoto was a realist, and the reality was unambiguous. Without carrier air cover, a surface force approaching Midway in daylight would be subject to attack from Midway's land-based aircraft. Without carrier air cover, any fleet action risked being dominated by American carrier aviation. The initiative had shifted. The moment for decisive action had passed. In the early hours of June 5, Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal. The combined fleet turned west, toward Japan. Spruance, for his part, handled the pursuit phase with the same careful calculation that had characterized his decision to launch at extreme range that morning. He advanced toward the Japanese fleet cautiously, close enough to maintain pressure, far enough to avoid being drawn into a night surface action where his carriers would be at a disadvantage. Some of his subordinates wanted him to push harder, to be more aggressive. Spruance declined. He understood that the battle had already been won, and that the most dangerous thing he could now do was to take a risk that might throw away what had been gained. American aircraft continued to attack the retreating Japanese fleet on June 5 and 6. Some successes were achieved. The heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, which had collided with each other in the confusion of the Japanese withdrawal and were moving slowly, were found and attacked repeatedly. Mikuma was sunk. Mogami was seriously damaged but escaped. These were real losses for Japan, but they were secondary to the loss of the carriers. The human cost of Midway was distributed unevenly in ways that say something about the nature of the battle. Japanese losses in personnel were substantial, approximately 3,000 killed, the majority of them going down with the carriers. The loss included a significant proportion of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and aircraft maintenance personnel. These were losses that the Japanese training system, which had prioritized depth of individual skill over breadth of numbers, was structurally ill-equipped to replace quickly. American losses were also serious: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men killed. Many of the men were the torpedo bomber crews, VT-8, VT-6, VT-3, who had pressed their attacks in inadequate aircraft against overwhelming odds. Their losses were disproportionately high, and the names of those men who flew into circumstances that offered them little reasonable chance of survival, and flew anyway, deserve to rest quietly in the record. The Japanese official reports initially concealed the extent of the defeat. The crews of the carriers were dispersed, kept away from the general naval population where they might spread the story of what had happened. The nation was told of a great victory at Midway. The emperor was not given accurate information for weeks. The culture of reporting within the Japanese military made it nearly impossible for truth to move upward through the hierarchy when that truth was catastrophically unwelcome. This concealment had consequences that outlasted the battle itself. Because Japanese naval planning in the months that followed proceeded, in some respects, as if the loss of 4 fleet carriers could be absorbed and overcome within a reasonable timeframe. The reality that Japan could not replace those carriers, or their air groups, or their experienced crews, with anything like the speed that the situation demanded, was a reality that the system was not designed to process and act upon. On the American side, the intelligence that had made the victory possible was itself closely guarded. The fact that JN-25 had been partially broken was one of the most closely held secrets of the Pacific War. When a Chicago Tribune correspondent published a story suggesting that the Americans had prior knowledge of Japanese intentions, it caused genuine alarm in Washington, fear that the Japanese would change their ciphers and the intelligence advantage would be lost. The investigation that followed was intense. Fortunately, the Japanese appear to have concluded that the Tribune story was either disinformation or lucky guesswork, and JN-25 continued to be a source of American intelligence for some time afterward. The waters north of Midway settled back into their natural calm as the fleets withdrew. The birds of the atoll returned to their nesting. The smoke that had risen from the burning carriers could still be seen on the horizon for some hours after the ships went under, and then it too was gone, absorbed into the vast indifferent sky of the Pacific. Every battle has its immediate outcome and its longer shadow. The immediate outcome of Midway was clear enough. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, several hundred of its finest aviators, and the momentum of its Pacific offensive. The United States had lost 1 carrier and had gained something far less tangible but more important: time. It is worth pausing on that word. Time. In June of 1942, the industrial capacity of the United States had only barely begun to convert itself from peacetime production to war production. The shipyards and the aircraft factories and the training programs that would eventually produce the overwhelming material superiority that crushed Japan in the war's final years were just beginning to shift into a higher gear. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, America was still fighting largely with what it had at the moment of the attack, with additions at the margin. The carriers being built in the shipyards, the Essex-class carriers that would transform American naval power, were months and years away from completion. If Yamamoto's plan had succeeded, if the American carriers had been found and destroyed at Midway, if Midway itself had fallen, if the Japanese defensive perimeter had been extended to threaten Hawaii, those months and years would have been bought at an enormous cost in blood and treasure and uncertainty. Even if, ultimately, the industrial weight of America had eventually overcome Japan's lead, the path to that outcome would have been far longer and far harder. Midway foreclosed that path. By destroying the Kido Butai, it prevented Japan from executing the kind of follow-on operations that might have made the war in the Pacific a far more prolonged and costly affair. Japan retained significant naval power, substantial carrier strength, in aggregate, remained available in the form of ships completing construction and older carriers not committed to the Midway operation. But the concentration of experience, training, and institutional capability embodied in the Kido Butai could not be reproduced quickly. The 6 months following Midway saw the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, a campaign that would eventually exhaust Japan's remaining stock of trained aviators and damage her surface fleet severely. The pattern that established itself at Guadalcanal, American persistence, American material advantage, American willingness to absorb casualties in exchange for strategic gains, was a pattern that would continue, in various forms, for 3 more years. The commanders who had made Midway possible were treated by history with varying degrees of recognition. Chester Nimitz remained in command of the Pacific Fleet through the war's end, presiding over the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces within bombing range of Japan itself. He was made a Fleet Admiral, the highest naval rank in American history, in December 1944. He remained modest about his own role at Midway, consistently directing credit toward the men who had fought. Raymond Spruance went on to command the Fifth Fleet in the Great Central Pacific Offensive, directing the invasions of the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and Saipan, and fighting the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where he made another characteristically cautious decision, refusing to be drawn westward in pursuit of the fleeing Japanese force. That was criticized at the time but was later vindicated. His reputation as one of the finest American naval officers of the war grew steadily, though he never sought publicity and was rarely recognized by the general public the way his colleagues were. Frank Jack Fletcher was relieved of carrier command after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, partly as a result of decisions made during that battle, partly because he was a convenient focus for frustrations that had accumulated during a difficult campaign. He was moved to theater commands in the North Pacific, where he finished the war competently but far from the center of action. History has been somewhat kinder to him than his contemporaries were. Joseph Rockefort, whose code-breaking had made the battle possible, was denied the formal recognition his work deserved during the war. His rival at Naval Intelligence in Washington, who had argued that AF was not Midway, worked to ensure that credit for the intelligence victory was distributed in ways that minimized Rockefort's role. He was reassigned from Station HYPO to a command, a floating dry dock, that was clearly punitive. The Navy's internal politics had overridden its institutional interest. He did receive, posthumously, the Distinguished Service Medal for his work at Midway, awarded in 1986, 14 years after his death. For Japan, the reckoning with Midway, the honest, structural reckoning, did not come until after the war. The officers who survived the battle were constrained by the culture of their service from speaking openly about what had happened. The concealment of the defeat meant that lessons which might have been learned in 1942 were not institutionalized in time to matter. Japan continued to fight with extraordinary skill and courage, but the structural disadvantages that Midway had exposed, the shortage of trained pilots, the vulnerability of tightly concentrated carriers, the intelligence failures, were not addressed with the urgency the situation demanded. Admiral Nagumo survived Midway and went on to command naval forces at Guadalcanal and in the Mariana Islands. At Saipan in July 1944, with American forces closing on his headquarters and the situation clearly hopeless, he took his own life. He was 60 years old. His legacy is complicated, a man of genuine courage and professional competence whose limitations of temperament and tactical imagination proved decisive at exactly the wrong moment. Yamamoto himself did not live to see the full consequences of the defeat he had suffered at Midway. In April 1943, American intelligence, again using decrypted Japanese communications, learned the precise schedule of an inspection tour he was making to forward bases in the Solomon Islands. American P-38 fighters were dispatched to intercept his transport aircraft. They found it exactly on schedule and shot it down over the jungle of Bougainville. Yamamoto, the man who had conceived and planned Pearl Harbor, who had understood better than almost anyone in Japan the risks of war with America, was killed by the very intelligence capabilities he had failed to fully account for. The four carriers of the Kido Butai, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, burned and sank across the course of June 4 and 5, 1942. Each of them took a long time to die, as great ships do. The fires burned through the night. Survivors were pulled from the water. Some men went down with their ships by choice. Some were trapped below decks and could not escape. The ocean received them all, and was unchanged. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu rested on the floor of the Pacific for more than 70 years before they were found. In October 2019, the research vessel Petrel, funded by the estate of the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located the wreck of the Akagi at a depth of approximately 18,000 feet, more than 3 miles beneath the surface. The Kaga was found nearby. Both rested on the sediment with a stillness that the photographs somehow convey, objects removed from the turbulence of history, lying now in the permanent dark of the deep ocean, beyond the reach of any further argument about what they meant or what they cost. The Yorktown was found in May 1998, located by explorer Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who had found the Titanic, lying upright at approximately 16,000 feet in the waters north of Midway. The photographs of her wreck show a ship that settled gently onto the ocean floor, her flight deck still recognizable, her island structure still standing, the ghost of a name still faintly legible on her hull. She is preserved now by the cold and the darkness, and by the designation as a protected memorial site that the United States government placed over her. The atoll of Midway itself is today a national wildlife refuge. The military facilities that covered it during the war have largely been removed or allowed to decay. The runways are still there, maintained for occasional use. The albatrosses still nest, in their hundreds of thousands, one of the largest Laysan albatross colonies in the world. They have been there far longer than any military installation, and they will be there long after the last physical trace of the battle has dissolved into coral and saltwater. There is a particular quality to the way that history settles around a battle of this significance. In the years immediately following the war, Midway was celebrated in America as a miracle, a moment when everything had somehow come together perfectly, when fortune had smiled on the just, when the tide had turned in a single morning. This narrative was satisfying and not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. It flattened the complexity into a story of pure triumph, which required setting aside the men who had died in inadequate aircraft pressing attacks that could not succeed, the codebreakers who were denied their recognition, the decisions that had been made badly as well as the decisions that had been made brilliantly. Later generations of historians, working with more complete access to both American and Japanese records, with the benefit of Japanese memoirs and post-war testimony and the declassification of intelligence records, produced a more textured account. The miracle, they found, was real, but it had been prepared by extraordinary human effort. The good fortune was real, but it had been shaped by decisions that could have been made differently and weren't. The victory was decisive, but it had been bought with a cost that the triumphalist narratives sometimes obscured. The most honest accounting of Midway holds several things simultaneously. It was a genuine turning point in the Pacific War, one of the most decisive single engagements in the history of naval warfare. It was made possible by the skill and sacrifice of thousands of people, codebreakers and carrier crews, patrol pilots and damage control parties, commanders who made good decisions under enormous pressure, and enlisted men who died following orders that sent them into situations where their chances were slim. It was also shaped by fortune, by a 30-minute delay in a catapult launch, by a navigation decision made by a tired pilot searching an empty ocean, by the chance alignment of timing that put American dive bombers over Japanese carriers at the precise moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. In this combination of preparation and fortune, of human decision and structural circumstance, of individual sacrifice and institutional capability, Midway is perhaps more representative of how history actually works than the cleaner narratives we often prefer. Things do not always go to the stronger or the better prepared. But preparation and intelligence and the willingness to make difficult decisions under uncertainty, these do matter. They matter enormously. And at Midway, they mattered enough to turn the war. The Pacific War continued for 3 more years after June 1942. There were battles of extraordinary ferocity and cost still to come: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the men who fought them should not be diminished by the shadow of Midway's fame. The war was won in its totality by the sustained effort of millions of people over years of grinding, terrible combat. Midway was not a magic ending. It was the beginning of the long, costly process of turning the tide back. But it was a beginning. And before it happened, there was no certainty that it would. The men who made it happen, the codebreakers who read the mail of the enemy, the admirals who committed their forces to a battle they could not be certain of winning, the pilots who flew in full knowledge of what waited for them, did not know how it would turn out. They made their decisions in uncertainty, as all human beings must, and the decisions they made were good ones, and the war bent in the direction of those decisions. That, perhaps, is the most important thing to carry away from Midway. Not the miracle, not the 4 minutes, not the perfect drama of dive bombers arriving at the exact right moment, but the long, patient, careful work that made those 4 minutes possible. The men in the dungeon, bent over their codebooks in the Hawaiian heat. The admiral who told his repair crews that he needed a broken carrier ready in 72 hours, and trusted them to do it. The pilot who decided not to turn back when the ocean was empty and his fuel was low. The sailors who patched and welded and repaired and sailed in a ship that was not fully whole. History is rarely made by single heroic moments, however much we need to tell it that way. It is made, more often, by the accumulation of thousands of careful, unglamorous choices, by people who do not yet know that they are doing something that will matter. The Pacific Ocean is very large, and very quiet, and very old. It was here long before the nations that fought over it, and it will be here long after the last account of their battles has been written and forgotten. Somewhere in its deep water, 3 miles down and more, the Akagi and the Kaga lie on the sediment floor. The Yorktown lies in her own darkness a little further east. They rest in a stillness that the photographs convey with something like peace, objects released from the urgency of history, lying now beyond the reach of argument or praise or blame. The men who flew from those carriers, on both sides of that June morning, many of them rest in the same ocean. They were young, most of them. They had families and futures and ordinary human hopes that the morning of June 4, 1942, cut short. Their names are held in the records of their respective navies, and in the memory of their descendants, and in the quiet regard of those who study the battles they fought. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you can hold something of that quiet regard. Not for the strategy, not for the outcome, not for the drama of the 4 minutes, but for the ordinary humanity of the people involved. The pilot who wrote a letter before climbing into his aircraft. The codebreaker who had not left his building in 3 days. The engineering crew who worked through the night to make a broken ship ready for sea. The admiral who looked at his repair crews and simply trusted them. These were people who did not know how things would turn out. They made their best decisions with what they had, in the time they had, with the knowledge they had. Some of those decisions saved lives. Some of those decisions cost lives. The outcomes were shaped by forces larger than any individual decision, and by moments of fortune that no human foresight could have arranged. And now, across the long distance of 80 years and more, the Pacific receives their memory gently. The albatross's nest on Midway's coral sand. The deep water holds its silence. The stars that watched the battle are the same stars that are above you now, patient and indifferent and constant. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day settle away from you. You have carried enough today. The story has been told, and the dead have been remembered, and the sea is quiet. Rest now. The night is long, and you are safe, and there is nothing more that needs to be done. Sleep well. If you're still awake, the battles are over now. Rest easy. Subscribe to Wars and Dusk for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.